David Carter's patrol car cruised slowly through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The small southern town was peaceful at night, but years on the force had taught David to remain vigilant. As he approached a bus stop on Maple Street, something caught his eye. A small figure huddled on the bench, shoulders shaking. David slowed the car, squinting through the darkness. It was a child, a young girl by the looks of it. She was alone, crying. His brow furrowed as he pulled the car to a stop. This wasn't right. No child should be out alone at this hour, especially not in distress. He hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. As a police officer, it was his duty to ensure the safety of all citizens, including children. But he also knew that approaching a crying child could be delicate. He didn't want to frighten her further. After a moment's consideration, David decided he couldn't ignore the situation. He stepped out of the car, approaching the bus stop slowly. As he got closer, he could see the girl more clearly. She was African American, no more than 9 or 10 years old, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans. "Hello there," David called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. "I'm fine," she mumbled, not meeting his gaze. David crouched down, trying to appear less intimidating. "My name's Officer Carter. What's your name?" The girl hesitated before answering. "Jasmine." "It's nice to meet you, Jasmine. Can you tell me why you're out here so late? Are you waiting for someone?" Jasmine nodded, still avoiding eye contact. "I'm waiting for my mom. She's coming to get me." David felt a pang in his chest. Something about her tone didn't sit right with him. "How long have you been waiting?" Jasmine shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. "Not long." David glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. "Do you know your mom's phone number? I could try calling her for you." Jasmine shook her head quickly. "No, it's okay. She'll be here soon." David frowned, torn between his instinct to help and his desire not to overstep. "All right, Jasmine, but it's not safe for you to be out here alone. Would you like me to wait with you until your mom arrives?" "No." Jasmine's response was quick and forceful. She seemed to realize how it sounded and added more softly, "No, thank you. I'm okay." David stood up slowly, still concerned. "If you're sure, I'm going to drive around the block, okay? I'll be back to check on you in a few minutes." Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground. As David walked back to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Jasmine's behavior, her reluctance to accept help, the late hour, it all pointed to a deeper issue. He climbed into the car, his mind racing. He should report this, maybe call Child Protective Services. But without more information, what could he say? That he'd found a girl waiting for her mother. It wasn't illegal, even if it made him uneasy. David started the engine, deciding to circle the block as he'd promised. He'd check on Jasmine again, and if she was still there, he'd have to take more decisive action. As he drove, David couldn't stop thinking about Jasmine's tear-stained face, the fear in her eyes when she first saw him. In all his years on the force, he'd seen plenty of troubled kids. But something about Jasmine's situation struck a chord with him. He resolved to keep an eye on that bus stop in the coming days. If Jasmine was there again, he'd dig deeper. There was more to this story, and David was determined to uncover the truth, for Jasmine's sake. Over the next few days, David made it a point to drive by the bus stop on Maple Street during his nightly patrols. Each time his heart sank as he spotted the small figure of Jasmine sitting alone on the bench. The scene was always the same, a young girl, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, waiting for a mother who never seemed to arrive. On the third night, David decided to approach Jasmine again. He parked his patrol car and walked over to the bus stop. Jasmine looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Hello, Jasmine," David said gently. "I see you're here again. Is everything okay at home?" Jasmine shrugged, her gaze fixed on her worn sneakers. "It's fine," she mumbled. David sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You know it's not safe for a young girl to be out here alone at night. Where's your mom?" "She's coming," Jasmine insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. As David was about to probe further, an elderly man walking his dog passed by. The man nodded at David, then did a double-take when he saw Jasmine. "Evening, officer," the man said. "I see you've met our little wanderer." David's interest was piqued. "You know Jasmine?" The old man nodded. "Everyone around here knows her. Poor thing lives in that old abandoned house on Elm Street with her mama. Though I use the term lives loosely. That woman disappears for days at a time, leaving the girl to fend for herself." David felt a surge of anger and concern. He turned to Jasmine, who was now staring intently at the ground, her small frame tense. "Is that true, Jasmine?" David asked softly. Jasmine remained silent, but her lack of denial spoke volumes. After the old man moved on, David tried to engage Jasmine in conversation, but she remained withdrawn. Realizing he wouldn't get much more from her that night, he reluctantly left, promising to check on her again soon. The next day, during his off hours, David drove to Elm Street. The abandoned house wasn't hard to spot. It stood out like a sore thumb, paint peeling, windows cracked, yard overgrown. David's heart ached thinking of Jasmine living in such conditions. He approached the front door and knocked. For a long moment there was no response. Then slowly the door creaked open. An elderly woman peered out, her face lined with worry. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, eyeing his uniform. "Ma'am, I'm Officer David Carter. I'm here about Jasmine. Is she your granddaughter?" The woman's expression softened at the mention of Jasmine. "Yes, she is. I'm Margaret. Please come in." David stepped into the dilapidated house. The interior was clean but sparse, showing signs of long-term poverty. Margaret led him to a small living room. "Is Jasmine in trouble?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No, ma'am," David assured her. "I'm just concerned. I've seen her alone at the bus stop late at night several times this week." Margaret sighed heavily, sinking into a worn armchair. "That child. She wanders when things get bad here, when her mama disappears on one of her binges." "Binges?" David prompted gently. "My daughter, Jasmine's mother, she has problems with alcohol." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I do what I can, but I'm old. I can't always keep up with Jasmine." David listened as Margaret poured out the family's troubles. Jasmine's mother had struggled with alcoholism for years. She'd disappear for days, sometimes weeks, leaving Jasmine in Margaret's care. But Margaret's meager social security checks barely covered their basic needs. "Jasmine's a good girl," Margaret insisted. "Smart as a whip, but she's hurting. She needs her mama, but her mama's not there for her. So she wanders looking for, I don't know, safety maybe, or hope." David's heart felt heavy. The situation was worse than he'd imagined. A child neglected, a family struggling, a community turning a blind eye. "Has anyone from social services been in touch?" David asked. Margaret shook her head. "We try to keep to ourselves, don't want to cause trouble. And..." She hesitated. "Well, folks around here don't always take kindly to outsiders poking into their business, especially when it comes to colored folks like us." David understood the implication. In this small southern town, racial tension still simmered beneath the surface. It was an ugly truth he'd confronted many times in his years on the force. As he left Margaret's house, David's mind was racing. The situation was complex, fraught with legal and ethical complications. But one thing was clear. Jasmine needed help, and somehow, some way, he was going to make sure she got it. As David drove away from Margaret's house, his mind was heavy with the weight of Jasmine's situation. The old woman's words echoed in his thoughts. Jasmine wandering the streets, looking for safety or hope. It was a heartbreaking image that he couldn't shake. The next day, David decided to dig deeper. He started by talking to other residents in the neighborhood. Most were reluctant to speak at first, but as David persisted, a clearer picture began to emerge. "Yeah, I've seen that little girl around," said Mrs. Thompson, who ran the local convenience store. "Always alone, always looking scared. I've tried giving her free snacks sometimes, but she rarely takes them." Mr. Johnson, the retired mailman, added his observations. "That child's been wandering these streets for months now. I've seen her sitting in the park, at the library, even behind the old factory. It's not right, I tell you." As David collected more stories, a pattern became clear. Jasmine wasn't just going to the bus stop. She was roaming all over town, seeking out quiet, secluded spots where she could be alone. The revelation hit David hard. This wasn't just a case of occasional neglect. Jasmine was essentially homeless, drifting from place to place in search of safety and comfort. Determined to understand more, David headed to Willow Creek Elementary, where Jasmine was enrolled. He met with her teacher, Ms. Adams, a kind-faced woman in her 40s. "Jasmine," Ms. Adams sighed heavily. "She's a bright girl, Officer Carter, very intelligent, but she's troubled. Her attendance is sporadic at best. When she does come to school, she's often tired, sometimes hungry. We try to help, but there's only so much we can do." "Have any of the other children noticed her absences?" David asked. Ms. Adams nodded. "Some have. There's a group of girls who've been asking about her. They seem worried." This piece of information gave David pause. It was the first indication he'd found that someone besides himself and Jasmine's grandmother cared about the girls' welfare. "Could I speak with these girls?" David asked. After getting proper permissions, David met with 3 of Jasmine's classmates, Emily, Zoe, and Tasha. The girls were initially shy, but as David gently questioned them, they opened up. "Jasmine's our friend," Emily said firmly, "but she's not been coming to school much." Zoe nodded in agreement. "We've seen her around town sometimes, like at the park or the library. But when we try to talk to her, she runs away." Tasha, the quietest of the 3, finally spoke up. "We're worried about her, officer. Is she in trouble? Can we help her?" David was touched by the girl's concern. It was a ray of hope in what had seemed like a community of indifference. "You're already helping by being good friends," he assured them. "Just keep being there for Jasmine when she does come to school, okay?" As he left the school, David felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, the situation was even more dire than he'd initially thought. Jasmine wasn't just waiting at a bus stop. She was essentially living on the streets, avoiding home and school alike. On the other hand, he'd found signs of hope. Jasmine's teacher was aware and concerned. Her classmates cared about her welfare. These were small threads, but perhaps they could be woven into a safety net for the girl. David's next stop was the local social services office. He knew he was treading a fine line. As a police officer, he didn't have the authority to officially intervene unless there was clear evidence of abuse. But he hoped that by raising awareness, he might be able to set the wheels in motion for professional help. The social worker he spoke to, a harried-looking woman named Karen, listened to his concerns with a frown. "We're aware of the family," she admitted, "but without clear evidence of neglect or abuse, our hands are tied. The mother hasn't been reported missing, and the grandmother is technically a suitable guardian." David felt frustration rising in his chest. "So we just wait until something terrible happens, until Jasmine gets hurt, or worse?" Karen sighed, her expression softening. "I understand your frustration, officer. I really do. But we have to work within the system. Keep an eye on the situation. Document everything. If you see any clear signs of danger or neglect, report it immediately. That's the best advice I can give you right now." As David left the office, he felt a mix of disappointment and determination. The system, it seemed, was not designed to help children like Jasmine, at least not until it was too late. But he refused to accept that. There had to be a way to help her, to make the community see and act. With renewed resolve, David decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't change the system overnight, but he could start making noise. It was time to rally the community, to make them see what was happening right under their noses. Jasmine's life might depend on it. David knew that to make any real change, he needed to get the community involved. He decided to organize a town meeting to discuss the issue of child welfare in Willow Creek, with a focus on Jasmine's situation. He spent the next few days putting up flyers, making phone calls, and talking to people on his beat. The response was mixed. Some people seemed genuinely concerned, while others dismissed the issue entirely. "It's not our business," one man told David bluntly. "If the girl's got problems, her family should deal with it." Despite the pushback, David persisted. He managed to secure the community center for the meeting and even convinced the local newspaper to run a small article about it. On the night of the meeting, David arrived early, his stomach churning with nerves. As people began to trickle in, he was disappointed to see that the turnout was smaller than he'd hoped. About 30 people sat scattered throughout the room, many looking bored or skeptical. David took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here tonight to discuss a serious issue affecting our community, the welfare of our children, specifically those who may be falling through the cracks of our system." He went on to describe Jasmine's situation, being careful not to reveal too many identifying details. As he spoke, he saw a mix of reactions in the audience. Some people leaned forward, looking concerned. Others crossed their arms, frowning. When David opened the floor for discussion, the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. "What do you expect us to do about it?" one woman called out. "We can't go around policing how people raise their kids." "Maybe the girl's just trouble," another man suggested. "Some kids are just like that, no matter what you do." David felt his frustration rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. "This isn't about policing families," he explained. "It's about recognizing when a child needs help and stepping up as a community to provide that help." The debate continued, growing heated at times. David found himself defending not just Jasmine, but the very idea that the community had a responsibility to its most vulnerable members. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, a young woman stood up. David recognized her as Emily's mother from the elementary school. "I think Officer Carter is right," she said firmly. "We can't just turn a blind eye. That little girl my daughter talks about, Jasmine, she's one of us. She's part of this community. If we don't help her, who will?" Her words seemed to shift the mood in the room. A few more people spoke up in support of taking action. Ideas were tossed around, from starting a neighborhood watch program to organizing a food drive for struggling families. As the meeting wound down, David felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. The turnout might have been small and the support far from unanimous, but it was a start. A seed had been planted. After most people had left, a group of teenagers approached David. He recognized them as students from the local high school. "Officer Carter," one of the boys said, "we wanted to let you know that we'd like to help. Maybe we could start a mentoring program or something for kids like Jasmine?" David felt a surge of hope. "That's a great idea," he said, smiling for the first time that evening. "Why don't we set up a time to discuss it further?" As he locked up the community center that night, David reflected on the meeting. It hadn't gone exactly as he'd hoped, but it wasn't a complete failure either. There were people in Willow Creek who cared, who were willing to step up. The challenge now was to harness that goodwill and turn it into concrete action. The next day, David's first stop was Jasmine's school. He met with Ms. Adams again, this time to discuss the possibility of setting up a support system for Jasmine and other children in similar situations. "I'm glad you're taking this on, Officer Carter," Ms. Adams said. "I've been worried about Jasmine for a long time. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." With the school on board and a group of motivated teenagers ready to help, David felt like he was finally making progress. But he knew this was just the beginning. There was still a long way to go before Jasmine and children like her could feel safe and supported in Willow Creek. As he left the school, David's resolve strengthened. He would keep pushing, keep fighting, until every child in Willow Creek had the support they needed. It was more than his job as a police officer. It was his duty as a member of this community. The day after the community meeting, David decided to pay another visit to Margaret, Jasmine's grandmother. He wanted to update her on his efforts and perhaps gain more insight into the family's situation. As he approached the dilapidated house on Elm Street, David noticed Margaret sitting on the front porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She looked up as he approached, a mix of recognition and worry crossing her face. "Officer Carter," she greeted him, her voice tired but polite. "What brings you back here?" David sat down on the porch steps, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "I wanted to talk to you about Jasmine, Mrs. Johnson. I've been trying to find ways to help her, to make things better." At the mention of Jasmine's name, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, officer. Not many people would care so much about a little colored girl they barely know." David felt a pang in his chest. "Every child deserves care and protection, Mrs. Johnson. Can you tell me more about what's been going on? About Jasmine's mother?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled hands twisting in her lap. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words began to pour out. "My daughter, Sheila. She wasn't always like this. She was a good girl, smart like Jasmine. But then she met Jasmine's father. He was trouble from the start, always in and out of jail. When Sheila got pregnant, he stuck around for a while, but then he just disappeared." David listened intently as Margaret continued her story. Sheila had struggled with depression after Jasmine's father left. She'd turned to alcohol to numb the pain, and things had spiraled from there. Despite Margaret's best efforts, Sheila's addiction had only worsened over the years. "And Jasmine?" David prompted gently. "How has she been coping with all this?" Margaret's face crumpled. "That poor child. She's seen things no child should see. Sheila, when she's drinking, she can be mean. She's never hit Jasmine, not that I know of. But the words can hurt just as much as fists, officer." David nodded, his heart heavy. He'd seen enough cases of emotional abuse to know the lasting damage it could cause. "Jasmine started running away when she was just 6, Margaret continued. "At first, she'd just hide in the backyard. But as she got older, she started going further. I try to keep an eye on her, but these old legs don't move like they used to." As Margaret spoke, David's resolve strengthened. He knew he had to do something more concrete to help Jasmine. An idea began to form in his mind. "Mrs. Johnson," he said carefully, "have you ever considered seeking help for Jasmine? There are places, safe houses, where children can stay temporarily when things at home are difficult." Margaret's eyes widened with fear. "You mean like foster care?" No, I couldn't. They'd take her away from me. She's all I have left." David shook his head quickly. "Not foster care. There's a place in the next town over, a temporary shelter for children in crisis. Jasmine could stay there for a while, just until we can get more support in place for your family. She'd be safe, well-fed, and she could still attend school." Margaret looked conflicted, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "I don't know, officer. Jasmine, she's not used to being around strangers. She might be scared." "I understand," David said gently. "But right now, Jasmine is scared every day. She's out on the streets alone, trying to escape a situation no child should have to deal with. This could be a chance for her to feel safe, maybe for the first time in her life." Tears were flowing freely down Margaret's cheeks now. "You really think it would help her?" David nodded firmly. "I do. And I promise you, Mrs. Johnson, I'll be there every step of the way. I'll make sure Jasmine is okay, and I'll keep working to get your family the help you need." After a long moment, Margaret nodded slowly. "All right," she whispered, "if you think it's best. But please, Officer Carter, promise me you'll look after her." "I promise," David said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll get through this together, Mrs. Johnson, for Jasmine's sake." As David left the porch, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Convincing Jasmine to leave the only home she'd ever known, even temporarily, would be a challenge. But he was ready to face it. For the first time since he'd spotted Jasmine at that bus stop, David felt like he was truly making progress. There was hope for Jasmine, and he was determined to see it through. The next day, David arrived at the temporary shelter with Jasmine. The girl clutched a small backpack, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity as she took in her new surroundings. David had spent hours the previous evening explaining the situation to her, promising that this was only temporary and that he would visit her often. As they walked through the doors of the shelter, a kind-faced woman greeted them. "Hello, you must be Jasmine," she said warmly. "I'm Ms. Rachel. We're so glad to have you here with us." Jasmine said nothing, inching closer to David's side. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Jasmine. Ms. Rachel is here to help. Remember what we talked about?" Jasmine nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said I'd be safe here." "That's right," David affirmed. "And I'll be checking on you every day, okay?" After getting Jasmine settled in her room, David had a long conversation with the shelter staff about her situation. He emphasized the need for patience and understanding, given Jasmine's background. As he was preparing to leave, Jasmine suddenly grabbed his hand. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "I'm scared." David knelt down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "I know you are, Jasmine, but being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared. And right now, the brave thing to do is to stay here where you're safe. Can you be brave for me?" Jasmine nodded, her chin quivering slightly. "I'll try." "That's all I ask," David said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll be back tomorrow, I promise." As David drove back to the station, his mind was racing. He knew that getting Jasmine to the shelter was only the first step. There was still so much work to be done. Over the next few weeks, David split his time between his regular duties and working on Jasmine's case. He visited her at the shelter every day, slowly but surely earning her trust. At first, Jasmine was withdrawn, barely speaking more than a few words at a time. But as the days passed, she began to open up. "Officer Carter," she said one afternoon as they sat in the shelter's small garden, "why are you helping me?" David considered the question carefully. "Because every child deserves to feel safe and loved, Jasmine. And because I believe in you. I think you're strong and brave, and I want to help you have the best life possible." Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes. "But my mom, she doesn't want me. She's always leaving me." David's heart ached at her words. "Your mom is sick, Jasmine. She has a disease called addiction. It doesn't mean she doesn't love you, it means she needs help, just like you do." As Jasmine began to feel more comfortable at the shelter, David turned his attention to the community. He organized a meeting with the group of teenagers who had volunteered to help, working with them to set up a mentoring program for at-risk children. "Remember," he told them during one of their planning sessions, "your job isn't to be a parent or a counselor. You're here to be a friend, to show these kids that someone cares about them." The community, too, was starting to take notice. David's efforts had sparked conversations about child welfare throughout Willow Creek. The local church organized a donation drive for the shelter, while the elementary school started a program to identify and support students who might be in difficult home situations. One evening, as David was leaving the police station, he ran into Mayor Thompson. The mayor, a portly man in his 60s, had been notably absent from the community meetings David had organized. "Officer Carter," the mayor said, his tone serious, "I've been hearing a lot about your extracurricular activities lately." David steeled himself for criticism, but to his surprise, the mayor's face broke into a smile. "I want you to know that what you're doing, it's good work. It's the kind of thing that makes a real difference in a community. Keep it up." David nodded, a sense of validation washing over him. "Thank you, sir. I intend to." As he drove home that night, David reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Jasmine was safe. The community was becoming more aware and involved, and even the local government was taking notice. But he knew the work was far from over. Jasmine's mother was still struggling with her addiction, and there were undoubtedly other children in Willow Creek who needed help. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, David felt like real change was possible. He made a silent promise to himself and to Jasmine. He would keep fighting, keep pushing for change, no matter how long it took. Because every child deserved a chance at a better life, and he was determined to make that a reality in Willow Creek. As weeks turned into months, David's efforts began to attract attention beyond the borders of Willow Creek. A reporter from the county newspaper caught wind of the story and reached out for an interview. Initially hesitant, David agreed after consulting with Jasmine and her grandmother, hoping that the publicity might bring more resources and support to their cause. The day of the interview, David met the reporter, Sarah Jenkins, at the local diner. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, notebook in hand and recorder at the ready. "Officer Carter," she began, "can you tell me how this all started? What made you take such an interest in this particular case?" David took a sip of his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just about one case. Jasmine's situation opened my eyes to a larger problem in our community. Children falling through the cracks, families struggling without support. I realized that as a police officer I had a unique opportunity and responsibility to do something about it." Sarah nodded, scribbling notes. "And how has the community responded to your efforts?" "It's been a mixed bag," David admitted. "At first there was a lot of resistance. People didn't want to get involved, didn't want to see the problem. But slowly things have been changing. We've got a mentoring program now, run by local high school students. The elementary school has started a support program for at-risk kids. Even the mayor has expressed his support." The interview continued for over an hour, with Sarah asking probing questions about the challenges David had faced and his plans for the future. As they wrapped up, she had one final question. "Officer Carter, what would you say to other communities facing similar issues?" David thought for a moment before responding. "I'd say that change is possible, but it takes effort. It takes a willingness to see the problems in your community and the courage to address them head-on. Most importantly, it takes everyone working together, law enforcement, schools, local government, and ordinary citizens. We all have a role to play in protecting our most vulnerable members." A week later, the article was published. David's phone started ringing off the hook. Local TV stations wanted interviews, neighboring towns reached out for advice on starting similar programs, and donations began pouring in for the shelter and mentoring program. Jasmine, who had been making steady progress at the shelter, became a symbol of hope and change for the community. With David's encouragement and support from the shelter staff, she agreed to speak at a town hall meeting about her experiences. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. David stood at the back of the room watching as Jasmine approached the podium. She looked small and nervous, but there was a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "My name is Jasmine," she began, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "A few months ago, I was alone and scared. I didn't think anyone cared about me. But then Officer Carter found me, and he showed me that there are people who care. He showed me that I matter." As Jasmine continued her speech, David noticed tears in the eyes of many audience members. Her words were simple but powerful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the difference that one person's care and attention can make. When Jasmine finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. People stood cheering and wiping away tears. David felt a lump in his throat as he watched Jasmine smile, truly smile, for what felt like the first time. After the meeting, as the crowd was dispersing, David overheard snippets of conversation. "I had no idea things were so bad for some kids in our town," one woman was saying. "We need to do more," a man responded. "We can't just sit back and let this happen." David felt a surge of hope. The community was finally waking up, finally seeing what he had seen all those months ago at the bus stop. As he was leaving, he felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Jasmine. "Officer Carter," she said, her eyes shining, "do you think my story will help other kids like me?" David knelt down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Jasmine, your bravery tonight has already helped more people than you can imagine. You've given a voice to kids who couldn't speak for themselves. You should be very proud." Jasmine threw her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As David hugged her back, he realized that this journey, which had started with one lonely girl at a bus stop, had grown into something much bigger. It had become a movement, a call to action for an entire community. And while there was still much work to be done, for the first time, David felt confident that real lasting change was possible. The success of the town hall meeting and the growing media attention brought new challenges and opportunities. David found himself juggling his regular police duties with an increasing number of requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and consultations with other communities looking to implement similar programs. One morning, as David was reviewing reports at his desk, the police chief called him into his office. "Carter," the chief said, his expression serious, "I've been watching what you've been doing with this child welfare initiative. It's impressive work." David nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Thank you, sir." The chief leaned back in his chair. "The mayor's office has been in touch. They want to create a new position, a community liaison officer focused on child welfare and family support. They want you for the job." David's eyes widened in surprise. "Sir, I'm honored, but what about my current duties?" "You'd still be a part of the force, but your primary focus would be on developing and implementing programs like the one you've started with Jasmine. It's a big step, Carter. Take some time to think about it." As David left the chief's office, his mind was racing. This new position could give him the resources and authority to make even bigger changes in Willow Creek, but it would also mean stepping away from some of the day-to-day police work he'd always loved. That afternoon, David had a scheduled visit with Jasmine at the shelter. As he walked in, he saw her sitting in the common room, working on what looked like a school project. "Hey, Jasmine," he greeted her. "How's it going?" Jasmine looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "Officer Carter, I'm working on a presentation for school. It's about community heroes." David sat down next to her. "That sounds interesting. Who are you writing about?" Jasmine ducked her head, suddenly shy. "Well, I'm writing about you." David felt a lump form in his throat. "Me? Jasmine, I'm not a hero." "Yes, you are," Jasmine insisted. "You helped me when no one else would, and now you're helping other kids too. That's what heroes do." As David listened to Jasmine talk about her project, he thought about the job offer. Maybe this was his chance to be a different kind of hero, not just for Jasmine, but for all the children in Willow Creek who needed help. Later that evening, David organized a meeting with the teenage mentors he'd been working with. He wanted to discuss the potential new position and get their thoughts. "If I take this job," he explained to the group, "I'll be able to do more to help kids like Jasmine. But I'll need your help even more. Are you up for that?" The teenagers exchanged glances before one of them, a girl named Alicia, spoke up. "Officer Carter, what you've taught us about helping others, it's changed our lives too. Of course we're up for it." The support of the young mentors, combined with Jasmine's words earlier that day, helped David make his decision. The next morning he went to the chief's office and accepted the new position. The transition wasn't easy. There were new responsibilities to juggle, bureaucratic hurdles to overcome, and always more children and families in need of help. But David threw himself into the work with the same determination he'd shown from the beginning. He expanded the mentoring program, worked with the school district to implement early intervention strategies, and partnered with local businesses to create job training programs for struggling parents. Slowly but surely, the community was transforming. A few months into his new role, David organized another town hall meeting. This time, the community center was packed to capacity, with people spilling out into the parking lot. As David took the stage, he saw familiar faces in the crowd: Jasmine and her grandmother, the teenage mentors, teachers from the local schools, and countless others who had joined the cause along the way. "When I first found Jasmine at that bus stop," David began, "I never imagined where that moment would lead us. But look at us now. Look at what we've accomplished together." He went on to outline the progress they'd made and the challenges that still lay ahead. As he spoke, he could see the determination in the eyes of the audience. They were no longer a community willing to look the other way. They were a community united in their commitment to protecting their most vulnerable members. As David concluded his speech, he locked eyes with Jasmine in the audience. She was smiling, her eyes shining with pride and hope. In that moment, David knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, every struggle was worth it. For Jasmine and for all the children like her, he would keep fighting, keep pushing for change, one day at a time. As David settled into his new role as community liaison officer, he found himself facing new challenges. One morning, he received a call from Ms. Rachel at the shelter where Jasmine was staying. "Officer Carter, Ms." Rachel said, her voice tense. "I think you should come down here. Jasmine's mother is here. She's asking to see Jasmine." David's heart raced as he drove to the shelter. He hadn't had any contact with Sheila, Jasmine's mother, since the girl had been placed in the shelter. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw a woman pacing outside the entrance, her movements jittery and unpredictable. Approaching cautiously, David called out, "Sheila, I'm Officer David Carter. We haven't met, but I've been working with Jasmine." Sheila whirled around, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Where's my baby? They won't let me see her. You can't keep her from me." David held up his hands in a calming gesture. "No one's trying to keep Jasmine from you, Sheila. We just need to make sure everything's okay first. Can we talk inside?" After some coaxing, David managed to get Sheila into the shelter's office. Ms. Rachel joined them, her face etched with concern. "Sheila," David began gently, "I understand you want to see Jasmine, but we need to make sure it's in her best interest. Can you tell me what's been going on with you lately?" Over the next hour, Sheila's story came out in bits and pieces. She'd been trying to get clean, she said. She'd even started attending AA meetings. But it was hard, so hard, and she missed her daughter desperately. David listened patiently, his mind working to process this new development. On one hand, he was glad that Sheila was trying to get help. On the other, he couldn't ignore the signs that she was still struggling. Her appearance was disheveled, her speech erratic. She didn't seem stable enough for a reunion with Jasmine just yet. "Sheila," David said finally, "I'm glad you're getting help. That's a big step, but I think we need to take this slowly for Jasmine's sake. Would you be willing to meet with a counselor here at the shelter? We could work together to create a plan for you to reconnect with Jasmine safely." Sheila's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You don't understand. She's all I have. I need her." "I know," David said softly. "But right now, we need to think about what Jasmine needs. And she needs to know that when she sees you again, it's going to be okay. That you're going to be okay." After more discussion and some gentle persuasion from Ms. Rachel, Sheila agreed to meet with a counselor. As she was led away to another room, David let out a long breath. "What do we do now?" Ms. Rachel asked. "Now," David replied, "we talk to Jasmine. She needs to know what's going on." The conversation with Jasmine was difficult. The girl's emotions swung wildly between hope and fear, excitement and anxiety. David did his best to be honest with her while still offering reassurance. "Your mom is trying to get better, Jasmine," he explained. "And that's a good thing, but it's going to take time. We're going to help her, and we're going to make sure you're safe every step of the way." As David left the shelter that day, his mind was heavy with the weight of this new development. He knew that reuniting Jasmine with her mother, if it was possible, would be a long and complicated process. There would be setbacks, disappointments, and hard decisions to make. But as he drove back to the station, a new concern began to gnaw at him. During his conversation with Sheila, she had mentioned Jasmine's father. "He's been sniffing around," she'd said, "asking about Jasmine." David hadn't pressed for details at the time, but now the comment loomed large in his mind. He remembered what Margaret had told him about Jasmine's father, that he was trouble in and out of jail. If Jasmine's father was back in the picture, it could complicate things even further. David made a mental note to look into the man's background first thing in the morning. He had a feeling that this situation was about to get a lot more complex. As he pulled into the station parking lot, David's phone buzzed with a text from one of the teenage mentors. "Big progress with one of our kids today," it read. "Can't wait to tell you about it." Despite the challenges ahead, David smiled. No matter how difficult things got, moments like these reminded him why he did this work. One step at a time, they were making a difference. And for kids like Jasmine, that made all the struggle worthwhile. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for David. He divided his time between supporting Jasmine, coordinating with the shelter and counselors for Sheila's rehabilitation, and investigating the sudden reappearance of Jasmine's father, Michael Johnson. What David uncovered about Michael was deeply troubling. The man had a long rap sheet, including charges of domestic violence and drug trafficking. He had been released from prison just a month ago, and his parole officer reported that he had missed several check-ins. One afternoon, as David was reviewing Michael's file in his office, there was a knock at the door. It was Officer Rodriguez, one of the patrol officers. "Carter, we've got a situation," Rodriguez said, his face grim. "That guy you've been looking into, Michael Johnson. He's at the shelter demanding to see his daughter." David's heart raced as he grabbed his jacket. "Has he made any threats?" Rodriguez nodded. "He's agitated, saying he'll tear the place apart if they don't let him see the girl." As they sped towards the shelter, David's mind was working overtime. He had hoped to have more time to prepare for this confrontation, to put safeguards in place for Jasmine. Now he was heading into a volatile situation with little preparation. When they arrived at the shelter, the scene was tense. Michael Johnson, a tall man with a wiry build and wild eyes, was pacing in front of the building, shouting threats. Ms. Rachel and the other shelter staff had locked the doors and moved the children, including Jasmine, to a safe room at the back of the building. David approached cautiously, his hand on his holster. "Mr. Johnson," he called out, "I'm Officer David Carter. I need you to calm down so we can talk about this." Michael whirled around, his eyes narrowing. "You the one keeping my daughter from me? You got no right." "Your daughter is safe, Mr. Johnson," David said, keeping his voice steady. "But your behavior right now is frightening her and the other children. If you want to see Jasmine, this isn't the way to go about it." For a moment, it seemed like Michael might listen to reason. But then, without warning, he lunged at David, swinging wildly. David managed to dodge the first punch, but the second caught him on the jaw, sending him staggering backward. Officer Rodriguez jumped in, trying to restrain Michael, but the man was fueled by rage and desperation. He broke free and ran towards the shelter entrance, clearly intent on breaking in. In that moment, David made a split-second decision. He couldn't let Michael get to Jasmine or the other children. With a burst of speed, he tackled Michael just as the man reached the shelter doors. They went down hard, Michael struggling violently beneath David. It took both David and Rodriguez to finally subdue him and get him in handcuffs. As the local police arrived to take Michael into custody, David caught sight of a small face peering out from one of the shelter windows. Jasmine had witnessed the entire confrontation. Once the situation was under control, David went inside to check on Jasmine and the others. He found the girl huddled in a corner, tears streaming down her face. "Jasmine," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Was that my dad?" David nodded slowly. "Yes, it was. But he's gone now. You're safe." Jasmine threw her arms around David, sobbing into his shoulder. "I was so scared. I thought he was going to hurt you." David hugged her back, his heart heavy. "It's okay to be scared, Jasmine, but I promise you I will always do everything I can to keep you safe." As the adrenaline of the confrontation wore off, David realized that this incident would have far-reaching consequences. Michael's violent behavior would likely result in his parole being revoked, which meant he wouldn't be a threat to Jasmine for now. But the emotional impact on Jasmine, who had now witnessed her father's violent nature firsthand, would be significant. Moreover, this incident highlighted the ongoing challenges they faced. Even as they made progress with Jasmine and worked on Sheila's rehabilitation, there were always new obstacles to overcome. Later that evening, as David sat in his office writing up the incident report, he received a call from the mayor. "I heard what happened at the shelter," the mayor said. "You did good work today, Carter. But this incident, it's going to raise questions. The press will be all over it." David sighed, rubbing his bruised jaw. "I know, sir, but maybe we can use this as an opportunity to show why programs like ours are so important, to show what these kids are up against and why they need our help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "You're right. Set up a press conference for tomorrow. Let's tell our story." As David hung up the phone, he felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but he was more convinced than ever that their work was vital. For Jasmine and for all the children like her, he would keep fighting no matter what obstacles lay ahead.